Hello. Well, as we continue our little lecture journey here in the sensation and perception course, we are now faced with a problem that we need to try to solve. It is called the problem of perceptual constancy. Now, at this point, I am going to assume that in addition to some familiarity with the essence of the sensation and perception problem, I guess, or theory that we have talked about already, especially what is referred to as the sensation mediated theory of perception. So as a reminder from the very first video and set of notes, we have this little diagram, and I didn't put it in here. I have a variation of it later, but I probably should have just put it in here to refer back to. But nevertheless, the idea is that objects in the world uh, just exist out there, and some form of stimulus energy is transmitted from the object to our sensory organs. In the case of vision, we would be talking about light reflecting from an object that is then registered by the eye. And some of the early chapters in the book, chapters 2 and 3 in particular, deal quite a bit of detail here with how all of that works, right? How the light is focused on the retina using the cornea and lens primarily, how the photoreceptors respond to the light, how ganglion cells essentially differentiate differences of light intensity across the retina, how cells in the LGN do a very similar function, but now differentiating across the activity of ganglion cells, and then how specialized neurons in the visual cortex respond to a variety of different properties of the stimulation. And then from there, try to understand how all of that is put together to actually recognize an object. And by recognizing an object, that means that we can look at it and identify what it is, but recognizing what it is also relevant to a variety of other kinds of properties that it has. Shape would be a crucial one, right? We look at a dog and a cow and a duck and a car and a tree, and they're all going to have highly specific and characteristic shapes associated with them. But it's not just the overall shape, but there are some, set of component features. And maybe those component features, think for the dog is going to have the particular shape of its body, but also its head and its tail, ears and snout and all of that sort of stuff. And each one of those has its own characteristic shape. But beyond shape, we also have to have size, and we have to have relative size, right? So that the relative size of the dog's tail or legs in relation to body size needs to be of the appropriate proportion, perhaps. And that's not to mention color, because different kinds of objects, like say the green leaves on a tree, would have to have their correct color in order to be hopefully recognized. Although, even though color is important, it's important to also note that a person who is colorblind, and there's different forms of color blindness, and we haven't yet assigned the color vision chapter, but nevertheless, a person who would be fairly rare to have what's called a monochromatic kind of color vision experience, which means everything is black and white to them, can still recognize an object even without the color, right? They can recognize a tree and a leaf without seeing that it's green. And anyone who's old enough to have watched black and white TV or just watch an old black and white movie, you can find that it is not particularly difficult to recognize things in a scene from the show or movie, right? So color is useful in a lot of respects, but maybe doesn't play a critical role in recognition. So what we've seen so far is that the visual system is faced with a pretty difficult challenge of recognizing an object. And I say it's a challenge because it's a challenge for perceptual scientists to understand it. But nevertheless, the visual system itself works pretty well, as it turns out, right? Um, then an average person with a functioning visual system should have no difficulty whatsoever in correctly recognizing and distinguishing different kinds of objects. And we do this quickly without any conscious thought or deliberation, right? We don't, there may be certain cases where um, our visibility is reduced, maybe because of vision problems, or maybe because it's a foggy day, or maybe because it's dark, or what have you. And because of that reduction in the information available to our eyes, or some impairment of the functioning of the visual system itself, we struggle to see and therefore to recognize and identify objects around us. But in a regular situation, sufficient illumination and sufficient light and sufficient lack of interference and a functioning visual system, we have no problems, right? Where we struggle here, the problem is in our theoretical understanding of how the visual system solves this problem. And it sounds very daunting, right? It sounds as if what we are starting with is a retinal image. And a retinal image, as defined, is simply the individual cellular activity of millions of rods and cones. And each individual rod or cone response is merely a response to light of a specific intensity in terms of photon flux, and also of light of a specific wavelength. And the intensity and the wavelength of the light determines the strength of the photoreceptor response. And these graded potentials of photoreceptor activity are then sent to all of these other retinal cells, bipolar cells and amacrine cells, and then the ganglion cells collect all of that. But the point here is that the activity of an individual rod or cone does not tell you what you're looking at. It simply just is a record of the light intensity and wavelength at that one location on the retinal surface. Doesn't tell you if that, say, greenish wavelength of light came from a leaf on a tree or a person in a green shirt. I think I've used that example before. And so if the individual photoreceptor doesn't know, quote unquote, know what you're looking at, how does the ganglion cell that's collecting information from those photoreceptors, quote unquote, know what you're looking at? And if the ganglion cell doesn't necessarily know what you're looking at, how do these neurons of the LGN, which are integrating at the activity of multiple ganglion cells, quote unquote, know what you're looking at? Or how do the cells in V1 in the brain, quote unquote, know what you're looking at if none of the other cells at the lower level know anything? Where does the knowledge, in fact, come from? Where does knowing actually begin or occur in the brain? And there's a reason why this is so challenging, right? This idea of where does the knowing come from? And I got to remember what I actually put on the slide here. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. Yeah, I'll jump to this third slide real quick. What I've described is a theory of vision that is defined by what psychologists call a poverty of stimulus argument. A poverty of stimulus argument is the claim that the amount of stimulus information available to the system under study, in this case vision, is impoverished, meaning it is weak and poor, and therefore of very low quality. I've mentioned a little bit about this in the first set of notes on sensation and perception, because I talked about the challenges of the retinal image itself, right? That it has various types of distortions. There can be all kinds of refractive errors, including the chromatic aberration, that not all of the light of the wavelengths of different wavelengths are refracted equally. The book talks about even more refractive errors that can occur. Retinal image is upside down. It's a mosaic of individual pointillistic responses of individual rods and cones. And as noted, none of that cellular activity has any psychological meaning. So essentially, we have meaningless input, right? And when we think about psychophysics as well, where all of this individual cellular activity is somehow, somewhere converted into visual sensations of brightness and color, the idea is that individual sensations themselves have no psychological meaning either. Again, it could just be the sensation of the experience of the color green, but I still don't know what it is that I'm looking at that has that property of being green, right? So that is not a meaningful experience. So we need to figure out, as the question is raised here on this slide, how does the brain decode all of that information of a distorted, pointillistic, meaningless array of data coming from the retina? But the bigger question is just, where does psychological meaning come from? Or as I said a minute ago, where does the knowing begin? At what point in all of these stages of visual processing, from the retina through the LGN, through V1 and V2 and other higher levels of visual processing, all through into the inferior temporal cortex of the brain, where does the knowing happen? And we still really don't have a good answer for that, right? We've got a lot of information explained primarily in chapter 4 of the book that really kind of explores what is happening in the brain and how some of these neural networks might function, but it hasn't really successfully addressed the real question of how the knowledge itself is created. I'm going to back up to that slide that I skipped over here. The question is also framed here as, how do we recognize any object? Now, I specified here, how do we recognize a familiar object? But we also need to think about something here, which is there a difference between perceiving a familiar object versus perceiving an unfamiliar object? Now, obviously, there is somewhat of a difference, because if I look at a familiar object, I'm going to look at it, I'm going to say, oh, that is a blank, right? Something that I know what it is, and I know its name, and therefore I can refer to it by its name. So we call that recognition, right? And of course, that's the implication here is that recognition can only be a word applied to something that we already know about, right? In fact, the phrase recognition, or what I have on the title of this slide, recognize, notice it has the prefix re, which means kind of like again, a second time. So we have previously cognized this object, but now we are recognizing the object, right? And so that means essentially that what's happening is that we are activating a cognitive pattern of activity in the brain that is already present in the brain because it's been cognized before. So that is, we have learned a pattern of activity in the brain that is associated with a specific object, and that to see it again means to reactivate that pattern and therefore to recognize the object as remembered. That's what's really implied by the term, right? But when we look at an object that we've never seen before, obviously we are not recognizing any pattern of activity in the brain. though it's worth pointing out that we can still see it just fine. And we can see its size and its shape and any other visible patterns like color and texture and so forth that it possesses. So we can see the object that is unfamiliar to us in a way that it is equally detailed as and rich of an experience as is the familiar object. The crucial difference is simply that we don't know what it is, and therefore we don't have a name for it, right? So is it even, given that, one of the things that we need to think about here is that a lot of the theories discussed in the book about object recognition kind of focus on learning, right? Because they focus on recognition, not just perception for the first time, right? And they claim, even when appealing to things like the deep neural networks, which I think is probably one of the most successful to date theories to explain how the visual recognition centers of the brain might work, is that there are these deep neural network, many layers to these that when trained on a sufficient amount of visual experience in early childhood, will eventually start to encode all of these different kinds of categorical knowledge, right? These image classifiers is one other way to think about it, right? And that's what maybe what the brain is just an image classifier. But the thing is that a computer that is trained using deep neural networks to perform image classification cannot really see objects that it has never recognized before, right? It will just simply not be able to detect anything there. So that's different. That's weird because humans can see things in the same level of detail, whether or not they are familiar or unfamiliar. I already said that. So is there any real difference, what I'm trying to get to here, between vision of familiar things versus vision of unfamiliar things? Do we need a different theory to apply to vision of the familiar, aka recognition, versus vision of the familiar, which is just prime cognition? I don't know. Well, that's a problem because these theories tend to never even address the whole concept of vision of the novel, right? These theories are only talking about how the brain could be trained to have some pre-established pattern that it would detect and use as a way of reactivation in the presence of an object we have seen already. In a way, these kinds of theories are inherently what we're going to call top-down theories because they require that past experience. And in the absence of past experience, these theories cannot explain how perception works at all. And therefore, they cannot provide any explanation of what happens in the visual system when we are exposed to a novel object. They might explain how that novelty becomes embedded into a neural network over time with repeated experience, and therefore how we come to recognize it later. But the fact that we can see it quite well without any experience is still is something that these theories don't even try to address. So that's a concern. I don't know if the annoyance in my voice is coming through, but that's the idea here, is that we really don't have any good theories in vision, as so far addressed, I should say, that are meant to account for this. Let me frame the question here based on what I have on the slide. Let me just, stop going off on these little tangents, I guess. So the problem of object recognition, as we have defined it, is that we are given an image, right? We are looking at something, and the light reflecting from the eye is captured by the lens and refracted onto the retina, which then projects an image to the retina. That image could be something like the image on the bottom of this slide. If you were standing in front of a set of 4 doors, and the one on the left was totally closed, and the one on the right was mostly open, and the other 2 in the middle were in various stages of being partly opened, then the image projected to your retina would be equivalent to this drawing, right? It's a 2-dimensional drawing of a 3-dimensional scene, but so is your retina, of course. And I have to then determine what it is I'm looking at. If I'm a brain with a visual system trying to take the retinal image and figure out what it is that I am seeing. Obviously, I just described what it is. It's doorways in various stages of being open or closed. But how do I know that it's a door? Well, again, I suggested earlier that objects are recognized by their shape, at least in part. Doors are and tend to be rectangular, though it's worth mentioning that not all doors are rectangular. If you've seen the Lord of the Rings movies, you may notice the Hobbit doors are kind of rounded, right? But that aside, and we still recognize them as doors, right? But these doors are rectangles, and yet they're not. Well, the one on the left is, but all the other 3 doors are not really rectangular in the image. They're trapezoids in the image, right? But if I were to ask a person to just look at any one of those doors and say, tell me, what's the shape of the door? Or if you have a door in your room right now and you look over at that door and just think to yourself, what's the shape of the door? Well, you ought to say it's a rectangle because that's clearly what the shape of the door is, right? But the image of that door on your retina is not going to be rectangular unless you stand in just the right position relative to that door so that it is perfectly square on your retina, which is what we see on the left-hand side, perhaps, of this image. But if you stand in any other position relative to the door, whether it's closed or open, doesn't matter. It depends on basically the relationship between where you're standing and the orientation and position of that door. It will project a non-rectangular image to your eye, which may be something like a trapezoid as shown here, or maybe some other form of parallelogram, but it will not be a rectangle with actual 4 right angles in the corners, right? So we could say that there is a form of ambiguity here because I have 4 different shapes in this image, but they all refer to the same thing. And so the question becomes, how do I recognize a door when I see a door? And if the answer is because I recognize it by its rectangular shape, well, how in the world am I going to do that when the image itself is not even rectangular? And now we've got a hard problem. This is where it becomes hard, right? Because we'll have to ask the question, I'm faced with an image, and maybe it's a trapezoidal image, and my brain has to say, what kind of object in the world could have created this trapezoidal image? And of course, it could be a rectangle. In fact, there's a little bit of geometry involved here, and we know that there are certain geometrical transformations that include one called a rotation, in which we can transform a rectangle into a trapezoid. And so maybe there are what we might call a whole set of possible shape, a set of possible shapes here, right? That could all be part of the same category if they are all related by a limited number of geometrical transformations like rotation, reflection, inversion, and so forth, right? So you learn about these in geometry, these geometric transformations. And I would say, well, the trapezoid could be a rectangle because the rectangle and the trapezoid are related to each other by a rotational transformation. And if there is another kind of shape that I might be exposed to that could not be geometrically retransformed into a rectangle, then maybe I'm going to not see a rectangle here, right? So the idea is that now the idea is I'm seeing a rectangle. Whenever I see an object that is either perfectly rectangular or at least is geometrically related to a rectangle because of a finite number of transformations that can be used to turn it into a rectangle. This requires us to have perhaps some form of implicit knowledge of these kinds of geometric transformations too. So that's what our brain maybe has to do, I guess, is to engage in some kind of geometric transformation of the input to recover its shape. How do I know that the rectangle is the primary shape here? I just kind of described a situation in which we're going to take this trapezoidal shape that is available to our retina and perform some geometric transformations to quote unquote recover the rectangle. But how do I know I'm trying to recover a rectangle in the first place? How do I know the rectangle has some sort of primacy as the original shape? Why can't I possibly conclude that the object, in fact, is truly trapezoidal in its nature? And therefore, when I'm looking at the rectangular door on the left, why doesn't my brain perform some sort of a geometric transformation on it to recover the original trapezoid, right? If you see what I'm suggesting here, I don't know which one is primary. Do I look at the trapezoid and quote unquote fix it up to turn it into a trapezoid by performing this implicit geometry? Or do I look at the rectangle and using the same implicit geometry in the reverse order, quote unquote, recover the trapezoid? There's ambiguity there, right? And so in order for me to determine what kind of object I'm looking at based on a given retinal image that I'm exposed to, it seems to require an assumption, right? This one requires the assumption that there are certain geometric shapes, like a rectangle or square even, that have a certain primacy, and that any other shapes like trapezoids and parallelograms just need to somehow be fixed up and transformed by the visual system to recover the original object shape. But again, this is the kind of recognition that assumes pre-existing knowledge and past experience of what shapes are considered to be more primary in nature. Can we develop a visual theory that doesn't require that knowledge, that can just handle the natural variation in visual inputs, right? That's the challenge here. So I've already described this slide, right? That we're essentially dealing with an input that has impoverished retinal images because of the distortions and inversions and pointillism, but also ambiguous retinal images from the previous slide because of the variation in the shape of the door. But there are other examples here of, well, here's a pointillism example. I probably should have went to that before I started to transition. Well, here we see an image of Mr. Spock from Star Trek, right? Well, when I was saying earlier that if you're looking at an object and one of your receptors is detecting the presence of something that's green, that receptor doesn't know what the green object is, right? Well, that's exactly kind of mirrored by this little collage of sorts, because this is an image of Spock, but it's made up of a bunch of smaller little images, so small I can't even really make out. It looks like a bunch of different people's faces. Each one is not Spock, clearly, right? And yet somehow in their aggregate, they become Spock. And that's kind of equivalent to what the visual system is doing just in a regular everyday sense, that this mosaic image is kind of like the mosaic of the retina itself is a mosaic. And somehow the mosaic of activity of the retina becomes this larger pattern, we still have to explain it, right? So this is the challenge here faced by our theories of vision. How can sensations indicate a state of affairs in the world? The state of affairs, meaning, what is it that I'm looking at? Is it this person named Spock? Is it a tree? Is it a dog? What is it? And I'm going to receive these sensations. But as already noted, the sensations are meaningless individually. They can be distorted in a variety of ways, and they are ambiguous as well. But we still need to try to trace a meaningful relationship between that sensory pattern and the object in the world. So it would be nice if there was what we would call a one-to-one relationship between sensory patterns and objects or states of affairs in the world. What is that? A one-to-one pattern. That's what would happen if every time I looked at Mr. Spock or the actor Leonard Nimoy, the exact same pattern of light arrived at my eye and created the exact same retinal sensory pattern. But that's clearly not the case, because Spock may look different on different days. Of course, we have to look at Spock from different angles. So sometimes we're looking at him from the left or to the right. And the same thing applies to the doorway, right? If I'm looking at the door from the left or the right, then I don't have the same sensory pattern. So that's, again, going back to our door example, a one-to-one relationship between object and sensory pattern would mean that every time I look at a door, I have the exact same sensory pattern. The presence of one object, a door, always results in one same sensory pattern at the retina. But the image that I showed you a couple of slides back here, let me just run back there, proves that that's not the case, right? Here we have the door seen from 4 different positions. And so therefore, even though it's the same object, it's 4 different sensory patterns. So there is no one-to-one mapping between object and sensory pattern. This is part of where we get the poverty of stimulus claim, is that because the relationship between object and sensory pattern is one to many, right? Think about that. You have one object, maybe it's a person or a door, but because you can look at that person or door from several different perspective angles, or in different lighting conditions, or from different distances, the actual retinal image that you experience will be many retinal images just for that one object. So that's a one-to-many mapping, right? It's also possible that we can have many-to-one mappings. How in the world does that occur? Well, one possibility of a many-to-one mapping might occur if you have 2 objects that are of different, maybe they look the same in terms of their shape. Imagine you just have, this is very, very generic and basic, but imagine just 2 red squares, right? But one is small and one is big. So they are different with regard to their size, even though they're the same shape and the same color. And if you look at the small one and the big one at the same distance, then clearly they will have different images on your eye, because they will, the smaller object will project a smaller image, and the large square will project a large image to your eye. And so that relative size difference is preserved in the retinal image. But if we move the smaller object a little bit closer to you, one of the things that should intuitively happen is that it will get a little larger in your field of view, right? We all kind of understand this intuitively, that when an object gets closer to you, it gets a little bigger in your field of view. We're going to leave the large object where it is, but we're going to bring the smaller one closer, right? So at some point, as the small object gets closer and closer, we will reach a point where its retinal image size is equal to the larger object that's far away. We're going to stop it right there, so that now we have these 2 red squares. One is small and one is big. but they both project the exact same retinal image to your eye. And so in this case, that's a many-to-one mapping because two different objects with two different sizes are projecting the same information to your eye. So it's one sensory pattern, but it's two different objects. 2-to-1 mapping, many-to-one. So if we put all of that together, the possibility of having one-to-many mappings and many-to-one mappings, we can see here that the mapping from the world to the sensory pattern is incredibly complex and incredibly ambiguous, right? It would be nice, as I had said, if it was one-to-one, because if it was a one-to-one mapping, that the presence of this object always equals the presence of this image, then there would never be ambiguity, and our visual system would not have to face any particular challenge of trying to understand what the sensory pattern means, because it would always be informative, right? It would always have a direct one-to-one correspondence between a sensory pattern and something happening in the world. But it seems as if these direct correspondences do not exist, and this is why the visual system has to deal with this ambiguity. This ambiguity is called the problem of constancy. But I've written this in a different way down here at the bottom. We perceive a constant and coherent, but keyword constant, perceptual world, despite the fact that the sensations are always changing. So that's really relevant to that example I just gave about the red squares, right? When that smaller red square is getting closer and closer to me, its visible size is increasing, right? But do I actually perceive it as getting larger? No, right? I'm going to do something like move my finger towards the camera, right? So here you see my finger. It's getting closer and closer to the camera. And as it gets closer and closer to the camera, it's getting larger. In fact, it's larger than my whole face now, right? So do you believe that my finger is larger than my face? No, of course not, right? That's perceptual constancy. You don't believe that my finger has grown to a massive size, right? That's not what you perceive. You perceive it as having a constant size, but it got closer, right? So you're perceiving a change, but the change is not related to size, it's related to distance, in fact, right? And so you see things as having a constant size in the world. When it comes to the door in the previous image, when the door swings open, its image shape transforms into the trapezoid, but we don't see it as transforming into an actual trapezoid. We perceive it as having a constant shape of being a rectangle, but it's now rotated, and so we understand that it's not really a trapezoid, right? We don't see it changing shape. We see it as having a constant shape, and therefore that's perceptual constancy. I see the fact that the door is a rigid rectangular object, and so it has a constant shape. The same as my finger has a constant size. So we call that shape constancy and size constancy, respectively, right? We are capable of correctly recognizing that objects have a constant shape even when their retinal image shapes change. And we are capable of perceiving that objects have a constant size even when their retinal image size changes. The problem is, how do we explain the ability of the visual system to explain perceptual constancy, right? How is it that the visual system can perceive the constancy of the object shape, despite the fact that the image is always changing shape? How is it that the perceptual system can achieve size constancy, despite the fact that the retinal image size is always changing? That's the problem that visual scientists, perceptual scientists needs to understand. I've got a few examples of constancy in here as well. There's other forms of constancy like brightness constancy. And I think I've shown you this picture before. The idea is that square A and square B actually have the same brightness levels. And so in this situation, we have a possible failure of constancy because we look at square A and call it a dark square and square B is a light square. Of course, it's also worth pointing out that maybe what our eyes are doing here are making ratio comparisons between the neighboring squares. In that regard, let's look at this, right? We have these two central squares, right? On the left, I've got a gray square, small gray square surrounded by a darker square. And on the right, I have a gray square, small gray square surrounded now by a lighter gray square. And if I were to ask you, which of those two small central gray squares is darker, or do they have the same brightness, we are likely to say that the one on the left is lighter and the one on the right is darker. But they really do, in fact, have the same brightness level. So again, possibly some failure of constancy here. But it's not always a failure. Here we see a bowl of fruit, photographed under 3 different lighting conditions. This may have been filtered, or another thing that you can simply do is just change the bulb in whatever lamp you're using from an incandescent to a fluorescent to a halogen. And each of those different kinds of bulbs emits a different spectrum of light. And so that differential spectrum of light that contains different wavelengths, typical old-fashioned incandescent bulb is probably a little shifted more towards the yellow end. Halogens are probably a little more shifted towards the blue end of the spectrum. That's what I think we're seeing there on the left and right. That's going to change the actual values of the light wavelengths entering into your eyes, all right? Which is related to color. But when I ask you to tell me what color is the banana on the left, well, you're going to say yellow each and every time, right? Even though the actual wavelengths of light entering your eyes are different across the 3 images, you still see that as the same banana and the same yellow color, even when it's tinted more blue, like on the right. In fact, you can see the difference, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily fundamentally alter your perception of what the color of that banana is, right? It's as if we are still somehow able to correct for the variation in the actual absolute values of the wavelength and still perceive the true color, right? The banana looks yellow, the lime looks green, the orange looks orange, the pear looks green, right? Strawberries look red, even though the actual color values. And it's the same kind of color across all of these images, right? You know, if I look at that lime in the top center, and even though it's a different kind of wavelength of light across the 3 images, if I were to ask you, is that the same lime? You'd say, yeah, that's clearly the same lime, right? So you know it's the same line, same color, it's all there. Here's a flower. So we see it's a purple flower, but the top part of the petal has a little bit of sunlight shining on it. So there's clearly a change in brightness and even a change perhaps a little in the actual wavelengths of light. So do I see that little illuminated tip of the flower as somehow a different color or brightness? No, I see that not as a change in the object, but as a change in the light. So what's happening here, and this needs to be kind of made explicit a little bit, is that when we are perceiving objects, we are not just perceiving objects in the abstract as a thing like a flower or a lemon or a banana. We are perceiving objects under specific kinds of illumination, engaged in a specific relation to our own viewpoint, going back to the door examples. So the talking about perceiving a state of affairs in the world is not just about trying to find one-to-one mappings between a particular object category and a sensory pattern, but it's about the overall state of affairs in the world, right? The object, the illumination, and the relative position of object perceiving, seeing animal with eyes, and the location and intensity of a light source. Not to mention background stuff as well. It's all there. We don't just perceive one object at a time. Oh, no, here's the dress again, right? Why is the dress a problem? Well, because as it turns out, here is a situation where the illumination has been messed up. When the person took this photograph, they were holding the dress in a particular position relative to the camera where it was in shadow. But you notice that the background, mostly visible to the right, is really, really bright. And that's because far off in the room, there was light shining on the background elements, but it was a different light. So let's go back to our flower. Here we see that the light spreading across a portion of the flower as well as the portion of the green leafy background is the same light. And therefore, the illumination across the entire scene is not perfectly uniform because there's shadow and light, but it's still relatively homogeneous in terms of the light areas and the dark areas are all consistent with each other. Here, the light areas and the dark areas are not consistent with each other. The foreground, the object under consideration, is entirely in a dark area, and the background that we need to separate from the object under consideration is purely illuminated. And therefore, the lighting is very different in foreground and background. And suddenly the visual system struggles with doing exactly what I said it's capable of doing, right? That it is able to achieve its goals of recognizing and understanding the world, because it's not just about perceiving the object by itself in the abstract, right? It is in fact detecting the relationships between the illumination across the entire scene and our position relative to that. And this photograph was just an unhappy accident that created a configuration where all of those relationships have been rendered ambiguous. But in reality, such as in this example, those relationships are much less ambiguous here. And therefore, it is therefore much easier to see the correct color of the flower as well as the correct color of all of the green leaves in the background. And even the green leaves that are in shadow are still seen as the same green as the leaves that have light shining on them, because we can detect the illumination variation in the correct way. Whereas in this picture, we cannot do that. This is actually an experiment that was done several decades ago by Gelb. And so this is kind of situation here, just to run back to this kind of picture here, right? Where what Gelb was able to do here is you can have a black disc, like a black felt disc on a dark background, right? So it's like a black circle on a dark gray background. And so you would think that if a person is looking at that, they would say that that the disc is in fact black, because of course it is. But what Gelb was able to do is, with a hidden light source off to the side behind a wall, he shines a little spotlight just on the black disc, and he ensures that none of that light is shining on the background, that the light is only shining on the disc. This is kind of like the opposite, a reverse of the dress picture, right? And then when looking at the disc, an observer standing in the position they're in, where they cannot see the light source and therefore they cannot detect the differentiation of light across the visual scene because of this restricted setup that Gelb created, will actually say that the disc is white, because all they see is a brightly lit circle against a dark background. Even though the thing itself is black, they see it as white, because to them it is very, very bright in relation to a dark background. You turn off the light and suddenly it's like, whoa, it's black, right? So what's happened there is that what Gelb did is exactly what happened in the dress image. He has made the relationship between the observer, the object, and the light source and its distribution across the scene ambiguous. But if we were to remove the little dividers there that prevent our observer from seeing the light source, you're bound to bet you that they're going to start seeing the object for what it is. They will, right? And of course, the fact that the light source is perfectly aligned to the shape and size of that disc doesn't kind of hurt to make this a challenge as well, right? So what we would say here is that this is reflecting a pattern called lightness constancy. And lightness constancy or brightness constancy is achieved by taking ratios, not absolute light values. So the idea here is that perceiving the brightness of a stimulus or the lightness of a stimulus, I'm just going to keep saying those both, depends not on the absolute light levels reaching your eye, which as we see in the checkerboard illusion, the light levels are identical, but it's about the ratio of the surrounding areas. So on the left here, we see a situation in which the center circle is darker than the larger outer circle. And so we assign high values to the brightness level. So 100 would be fairly dark gray, 200 would be a medium gray. And over on the right, we have a dark circle. If we could see the 0 there, there would be a 0 on that because that's absolute dark, right? The light circle has a value of 500, right? So the idea is that one of the things we can do is perform a matching test here. So what I want to have somebody do is alter one circle to match the other circle, right? So if I wanted someone, let's say I gave someone like a control knob, and that control knob allows them to change the gray level value of that black circle in the center of the 500 larger circle, so that they make it a little grayer, right? A little lighter. And I tell them that what I want them to do is I want them to match the perceived gray level value of the 100 value circle over on the left. Well, they could tune it to 100, right? But that's not what they're going to do, because that would be an absolute match. What they're going to do is they're going to tune it to 250, right? And that would be the relative match. So the relationship between the 100 and the 200 is obviously 50%, right? And the same goes here when they start adjusting that black circle. Once they get it to 250, it's going to have the same relationship to its background as the 100 circle does. And then that's going to cause them to be equally gray from the subject's perspective. That's what Wallach's experiment found, is that when people perform these matching experiments, that when they're matching, they are not matching absolute light intensity values. They are matching ratios, even when they're not even aware of it, right? So crucial finding there that shows that, again, visual perception is not about seeing objects as isolated things all by themselves, irrespective of the background, but it's about perceiving relationships between the object and its background and the illumination across the entire scene, as well as, when relevant, our own position and perspective relative to the entire scene. So here is just my illustration again of what Wallach's participants really were doing, right? They were adjusting that to 250. So as we have learned, despite our desire to find a one-to-one mapping between objects and sensory patterns, reality is that it's a many-to-many mess, right? That these are what the mappings would look like in the abstract, right? But the idea here is that we have both many-to-one and one-to-many mappings from world to visual patterns. And so resolving the many-to-many mess, here is just another, I said there was a variant of the original tree perception diagram here that kind of describes a lot of these mapping patterns, right? The distal stimulus to proximal stimuli could be one-to-many, especially with the door example. What's the relationship between proximal stimuli and sensations? Well, that's where psychophysics comes into the play, because here with psychophysics, what we learned, especially with Stevens' power law, is that the relationship is highly nonlinear with different kinds of curves depending on the nature of the task we have designed. So mapping proximal stimuli to sensations themselves is very difficult to do because of that nonlinearity. Presumably, the mapping from sensations to perception is many-to-one because, again, we're somehow able to take all of the variable sensations and resolve all of that into a coherent, constant perception of the world. But our challenge is to explain how we are able to do this. And the answer is still, especially given the so-called sensation-mediated view, where the idea is that the only thing we have to go on to figure out what we're looking at are those ambiguous sensations, perhaps is going to be a challenge for us to develop an explanation of that. Again, this is why it's called the problem of constancy. Are those all the same shape? Right? Could be, right? But they can all project different images to our eyes, so that's a one-to-many mapping. And so our problem is to explain exactly how it is that perception is more closely tied to the distal object, that is the cube itself in this case, despite being based on retinal images, which are not cubic whatsoever, right? It's a bunch of squares and parallelograms and trapezoids that we're looking at here. But we're not seeing squares and parallelograms and trapezoids. We're just seeing a cube from 3 different perspectives. So at the perceptual level, our perception is very closely aligned to the distal object. But presumably in between, we'll go back here, in between the distal object and perception would be all of these proximal stimuli and sensations, which are ambiguous and nonlinear and so on and so forth. And so perceptual systems are faced with what almost seems like an intractable problem. That's a big theme in chapter 4 of the book, is how this might occur. Here's our door example again. I guess I got a little ahead of myself in showing you that already. Here is a many-to-one mapping. I was describing the red squares earlier. This is another situation where red squares oriented in different positions could lead to to the same image on the eye, right? And also shape or size constancy, right? So these diagrams illustrate the essential principle of size constancy. I'm just going to show you these real quick. So the basic idea on the top here is a many-to-one mapping. We have 3 different objects of size 1, S1, size 2, S2, and size 3. So S1 is small and S3 is large, right? But they are presented at 3 different distances, which is D1, D2, and D3. And so now that we have perfectly mapped the size and the distance just so, each of these 3 objects could potentially project the exact same retinal image size. We're going to call that S subscript I, I for image here. And so 3 objects of 3 different sizes all project the same image size. That's like my red square example from before. Here at the bottom, we have a kind of a corollary to that, a one-to-many mapping, where we have the object of same size, but seen at 2 different distances, distance 1 and distance 2. And they each project different angles to the eye, which therefore means that their image on the retina will be different, right? The object that is closer projects image 1, which is larger than the object that is farther away that projects image 2. And this graph is also showing why this happens, right? Why is it the case that the apparent or image size varies with distance? And this is a function referred to as the visual angle. And so the visual angle is that angle that is subtended by the pupil or the lens with rays that extend to the tops and the bottoms of the object that capture the vertical size of the object here. All right. So the purple lines, that purple triangle or purple angle there has the angle alpha 1. We tend to use the Greek letter like an alpha when describing visual angles. And then the blue angle is alpha 2, right? And alpha 1 is clearly larger than alpha 2. So closer objects tend to have larger visual angles. We can describe the relative size of an object in our field of view by referring to its visual angle. And just for the sake of it here, I decided to include the math of that, if you're curious. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to be testing you on the math here, right? But for those who are curious, you can see exactly why distance is important in the visual angle because you have to divide by distance to calculate that. This is a trigonometric function, right? So we have a triangle essentially, right? The triangle has that base of the that refers to the size of the object, but that's the base within have a length s, and we know the angle alpha, and so what determines the size of alpha? Well, it would be the distance, right? So this trigonometric function says that if you take the arctangent of s over 2d and then multiply that times 2, you will end up being able to calculate the size alpha. And so in that case, you can see here how the size and the distance together determine the visual angle of an object. Small objects, or in the numerator, s will have small angles, but if the s is large, then you'll have a large angle, right? But with distance, it's an invert relationship, and that's why distance is in the denominator. Increasing distance tends to decrease alpha, right? So we are left now with our problem of constancy, which we do not have an answer for, according to the sensation-based approach. What we have is we have retinal images that are ambiguous with respect to brightness levels, wavelength and color levels, image shape and object shape, and image size and object size. All of that information is inherently ambiguous at the level of the retinal image, and therefore at the level of the input to the visual system. And somehow, some way, the visual system is able to correct for all of that ambiguity and still correctly perceive the constant properties of objects in the world, despite the changing properties of the stimulation itself. And we don't have a theory for that. But what we could do, and this is where we're going to save it for a part 2 on this video, is transition to a different approach, where maybe we could somehow find a different way to talk about the information available to the visual system that does not involve so much ambiguity, and therefore maybe, just maybe, does allow us to discover some one-to-one patterns. Okay, well, if that's possible, that would fundamentally change a lot about how we do vision research. So until next time, this is your professor signing off.